Rick will speak about 30 or 40 minutes on his research, which is a result of a Nuffield Foundation grant. Nuffield Foundation, very prestigious. This is a considerable piece of research. Quite a lot of effort from Rick and his team, and I'm sure he will tell you a lot more about that in due course. But as you know, the theme today is Beyond the Toxic Trio. And I think the audience here will be quite familiar with the toxic trio and how that's entered into common social work parlance, as it were. But Rick has some alternative thoughts and views resulting from his research that add nuance and new value and understanding to some of our ideas about work in children's social care. I think without further ado, really, I'm going to pass over to Rick, and very much looking forward to hear what he has to say today. And you can do a virtual round of applause, and Dr. Rick Hood.
Okay, thanks very much, Dermot. And so I'm just going to share my screen. The title of the presentation today is Beyond the Toxic Trio, and it's research findings in relation to demand and demand typologies in children's social care. So this is the results that I'm going to be presenting today are part of a 2-year research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which looked at system conditions in children's social care and how they were linked to welfare inequalities. It was quite a large study, so we won't be covering the whole of it today. And if you're interested, there are links at the end of this presentation to the main report on the project website. Besides me, the people on the team were Ali Goldacre, Sarah Gorin, Paul Bywaters and Callum Webb. And particular mention to Ali Goldacre, who's the quantitative analyst and did most of the analysis on which the results I'm presenting today are based. Thank you as well to our 6 participating local authorities and 2 members of our advisory group. So the main problem that I'm going to be trying to address today is the problem of demand in children's social care. So this is obviously a very topical question because of the COVID pandemic and the surge in demand that's occurring and that agencies are struggling with at the moment. But it's also a much longer term problem. This is partly because children's services over the past 10-20 years have become increasingly focused in terms of what they do on child protection and on providing services for children in care. And for various reasons, this is believed to be unsustainable. So while referrals may fluctuate from year to year and rates of children in need may remain stable, what is tending to be happening is that we're increasingly shifting in this system towards what is sometimes called late intervention. And this has various side effects, some of which we'll consider today. What we also know is that child welfare interventions have quite a steep social gradient. So what that means is intervention is disproportionately focused on children from more deprived families and neighbourhoods. And we often accept this in a way that it starts to become normal and familiar, but you know we shouldn't really. It's a sign of inequality in our society. What we also know is that some local authorities intervene more than others, not because there's some sort of postcode lottery, but because of systematic effects that are to do with deprivation and other structural factors. So Paul Bywaters and colleagues, whose work I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, have researched these welfare inequalities and found what they called an inverse intervention law, which means that local authorities that are on the whole on average less deprived or more affluent areas tend to have higher rates of intervention once you allow for or control for the fact that you need to compare children that are at an equivalent level of deprivation themselves. So one way of looking at this is to think about the area near where I live, which is Richmond or Kingston. As a whole, has fairly low rates of intervention compared with somewhere like Blackpool, which is a very deprived local authority in England, and on the whole has very high rates of intervention. When you compare neighbourhoods that are of an equivalent level socioeconomically, it's the Richmonds and the Kingstons that have higher rates of intervention. And what we can glean from this, so this is not to say obviously that interventions are being made inappropriately, and we know that children that are at risk need support and need intervention. And what it means is that there's something about the social context of demand that we're struggling to address. And part of the reason for that is, of course, this focus on late intervention. So when children and families that are in crisis come to receive services from children's social care, the social worker's assessment focuses pretty exclusively on risk factors in the family. So individual risk factors, if you like, such as domestic violence, parental substance misuse, and parental mental health problems. And what this leads to is an often quite individualizing, sometimes stigmatizing kind of language and approach, which is exemplified by this phrase, the toxic trio, which has become entrenched in practice and is very well known in the literature, and for which actually the evidence base is surprisingly limited. So there's a systematic review on this coming out, written by Paul and others, that examine the evidence base for toxic trio. And what we know, obviously, is that this idea that that there are three risk factors in particular, mental health, substance misuse, and domestic violence, that when found in combination, really elevate the risk to children's safety and health and well-being. That comes initially, at least, from serious case reviews. So these are reports that are written when a child dies or suffers serious injury as a result of abuse or neglect. And these factors in combination often occur when the history of these cases is reviewed. But apart from that, there is a fairly limited evidence base for this concept. And in fact, the only study to have done any kind of comprehensive examination of what factors and needs are present in, broadly speaking, in the cases and episodes that are dealt with by children's social care is the study I'm about to describe. And you know, that may come as a surprise. It certainly did to me. So what we need is a better understanding of demand. So the National Audit Office did a report last year which also said, well, we need to understand demand better for children's social care. What we have at the moment is fairly limited to either individual risk factors, which are recorded from social work assessments, which tell us something but only so much, or some sort of aggregated information about rates of intervention at particular thresholds. So I know most of you will be familiar with this, but it's just worth, given the results to come, to briefly outline what those thresholds are. So that the children's social care system is fairly complicated, but can be understood as a series of horizontal levels or tiers. So if you imagine that there's children in the community who need things, who need support from services, usually they get those from universal services, such as GP surgeries or schools. If there's a need or if there's a potential need for statutory intervention, the first step is usually a contact. So that might be the family themselves or a professional contact statutory services. And it's what happens after that contact that determines what kind of provision the child gets. So some children then receive services through early help. Sometimes there's a need for a multi-agency safeguarding hub to gather further information. So that's the MASH. And usually only after some of those checks have been done is a referral officially accepted by children's social care. And it's at this point, only after this point, is administrative data routinely collected and reported by services. So in our study, we're concerned with what happens after a referral. And after referral, there may be no further action, an FA, or the child may receive an assessment. So, so the results that we examine are what happens after a child receives an assessment from a social worker. After that happens, the child may be deemed as not requiring statutory children in need services, so they might get something else from early help, for example, or the child may be recognised as a child in need, may receive a care plan that is coordinated then by a social worker allocated to the child. Some referrals go straight through into child protection procedures, or other children receive child protection procedures as children in need. So that may consist of an investigation or a child protection conference, or for a small minority of children may receive child protection plans. And then at the top of this pyramid, if you like, are a very small number of children who are accommodated in care and receive services as part within the care system. So you can imagine this as a filtering and a progression of children and of referrals through a series of thresholds. So this is important for what we will come to shortly. So what our research in this part of the study was concerned with was what can we understand about demand for those children that receive a social work assessment. So social workers record anything up to 40 factors of assessment at assessment when they carry out an assessment, and which can overlap. There can be more than one, or there may be no factors at all recorded for some assessments. What we're interested in knowing is, are there consistent patterns of demand that cannot be directly measured through an individual factor assessment, one or the other, but we do relate to clusters of them. Okay, so we're looking at what actually are the patterns of demand that underlie the needs of these children that are coming into the system. Having identified such patterns, such categories, what can we say about those children who fall into them? So are there particular children with particular ages or gender or ethnicity that tend to present with certain clusters of needs? And what is the service response? So what kind of services do these children receive? So what we did to try and answer those questions, we collected anonymised administrative data for all children referred to services over a 5-year period in 6 English local authorities. So those local authorities were all in South East England, and most of them were in and around the London area. So it's geographically limited to the southeast of England. As you can see, there were around 115,000 episodes, so a very large amount of data at the case level. So we linked information about episodes to child characteristics. So the unit of analysis was the episode rather than the child, and that's obviously because children can be referred more than once over a 5-year period. So we linked the episodes to what limited information was recorded about the child, and then we focused on the factors at assessment. So there, as I said, there are 40 of these that social workers can record. So we used a type of statistical analysis called latent class analysis to try and identify the underlying constructs. So these are the latent variables, things that the patterns of demand that you cannot measure, but which are related statistically to particular clusters of factors. So this is a kind of analysis that is inductive, if you like. So it's not that we had any kind of model, or we had a hypothesis we were testing here. We were seeing what emerged from the patterns of factors at assessment across 115,000 episodes. And what we wanted to know was how many of these there were, and were they consistent across the local authorities, or did local authorities each have quite unique patterns of demand? And then once we had these latent classes or typologies, we investigated the characteristics of children in each category. you know, in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and so on, and what kind of services they received based on the thresholds of provision. So this overall was what we found. We found that there were 7 demand classes or typologies. So we're able to reduce, if you like, these 40 individual factors at assessment to 7 broad patterns that were consistent across all 6 local authorities. So it wasn't that they all had their own patterns. These 6 local authorities seemed to have these consistent categories of need that were coming into the system and receiving services. In terms of the methodology for this, the way this was done was we did the analysis initially on a random sample of 2,000 episodes from each local authority, and then once the classes were established, we assigned each episode in the data set to one of those classes, and that was done on a mutually exclusive basis. So a single episode could only belong to one class, not to several. Having done this, we tried to see if we could profile them in terms of children's characteristics, and found that in a lot of ways we could. We'll see the results of that shortly. And we found that they differed widely in terms of intervention pathways. So, for example, the likelihood that an episode would go on to child protection did differ quite significantly depending on the category of need. Now, some of the classes we found were particularly dominated by a single factor assessment, and some of them were characterised by clusters, by multiple factors. What we weren't actually setting out to find or not find evidence or not for the so-called toxic trio, but what we did find in terms of the complex needs that seemed to characterise some of these categories was caused us to question a little bit why the toxic trio is seen as such a hard and fast way of conceptualising demand, because we didn't think that fitted the data at all, and we'll see why shortly. So I'm just going to go through the 7 types or typologies of demand that we found. And these were consistent across the 6 areas, as I say. Now, the first 3 typologies were characterised by pretty much a single factor assessment, and that makes them pretty easy to name. So as you can see, that first type of demand is neglect. So in 100% of these episodes, neglect was the only factor at assessment. So the social worker did an assessment, neglect was the only thing that was recorded there on the administrative database. And this was 13% of all episodes, and characterised across all the LAs by younger children. So this is a younger age profile. A gender profile differed between local authorities, which is quite interesting. So more boys in a couple of local authorities, more girls in a couple. And the main source of referral, these were often being referred by schools. And of these neglect cases, this neglect on its own category, about 15% would go through to child protection, and about 6% would result in some form of a child look after episode. Now, the next single factor typology was about domestic violence. Again, 100% of these had domestic violence as a factor, and there was a fairly small probability that emotional abuse or alcohol misuse would also be assessed at the same time. This was a high percentage of episodes, so around 17%, no significant gender profile, but again, this was mainly younger children. A much lower percentage of these went through to child protection procedures, and this was the one that had the least chance of resulting in an episode in care, so only 1% resulting in an episode in care. And as you can see, the police are the majority source of referral. So these are Merlin reports, referrals coming in from the police about domestic violence in a family where there are children, and the most common outcome for this is that no service is provided, even when an assessment is being done. Now, the third single factor typology is the physical abuse. So again, 100% of cases with physical abuse, and some likelihood that emotional abuse or neglect would be assessed at the same time. It's about 12% of episodes. Again, differences between local authorities, whether it's more boys or girls, and these are school-age children being referred in, the majority of them by schools, and where about 10% of them are going through to child protection procedures, and about 4% resulting in an episode of care. Okay, so what's one thing that's worth noting about this is that this all adds up to just over 40%, 42% of all episodes can be characterised by a single issue practically, which I think is really interesting for planning and strategic design of services. I will come to that a bit later. So the next two typologies, we call them multiple factor, and you can obviously see why. So they're not dominated by a single factor assessment, they come in clusters. You can see there from the percentages the probability of these factors coming together in any single episode. When we looked at these, we thought that, I mean, they're difficult to name and label these episodes because they're multiple factors. We thought it was indicative of children who were probably out of parental control and were highly vulnerable for various reasons, as you can see, for reasons of mental health, potential risk of self-harm, child's own drug misuse, and the risk of sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. As well as what you might term more externalising socially unacceptable behaviour. As you can see, this was quite a frequent episode. This is 21%, so around a fifth of all episodes come into this category, more likely to be girls, and unsurprisingly older children, peaking at around the age of 15. And given those risks, it might surprise you to see that only about 6% of these episodes go through to child protection. 3% results in an episode of care, and the referrals are often coming from the police. We did question when we saw this whether there were two categories in one here, but the data didn't seem to suggest that. So there's something here about these young people being assessed potentially in relation to risk to themselves, their vulnerability in terms of their own vulnerability, or risk to others in terms of socially unacceptable behaviour, and how the two are actually fundamentally connected. The next category is it's about disabilities, you can clearly see, and obviously children with disabilities are recognised as children in need. We found the connection with mental health a little bit surprising, and we don't really understand why this is. We need to go back to agencies and find out more about this particular category, and how the parents' own disabilities and mental health connects with the needs and vulnerabilities of the children. Again, this is predominantly boys. It's only 7% of all episodes, and again, it's older children. So you've got a real age, strong age profiles coming through with these categories. And yes, only 5% going through to child protection and 2% through to episode of care, and often referred by schools. And these are the last two typologies. So up to now, of course, you'll have seen that we haven't that we've seen quite distinctive categories of need. Here we have complex needs that seem a little bit more linked with each other, but present a quite different risk profile. So we called them, a little bit unimaginatively perhaps, complex needs 1 and complex needs 2. Now the first of these categories, to any social worker looking at this, they will immediately think about the toxic trio because those factors are there. This is actually the most prevalent episode across these 6 local authorities. 26%, so over a quarter of all episodes fell into this category. It's a younger age profile, particularly characterised by two factors actually, domestic violence and parental mental health problems, seeming to be associated more with girls, particularly in some local authorities, and with a fairly high chance of going through to child protection, 17% there. But you probably won't remember, but this is only 2% more than the neglect on its own category, which was 15%. So there's 17% of these going through to child protection, 5% resulting in an episode of care, often being referred by the police. So the majority of these, you may be surprised to know, that the most common outcome for this kind of episode is for the assessment to say not child in need. So the majority of these episodes are not resulting in a service, a statutory service. Now this is the final category now, complex needs 2, and the least common one. And as you can see from those percentages, this is the one where those cumulative combination of risk factors are most apparent. So you've got a high likelihood of domestic violence co-occurring with things like emotional abuse, parental mental health, neglect, physical abuse, and so on. Well, you'll see here it's not just about the so-called toxic trio. There's a lot of other things going on here. These are older children, so you can see these needs are accumulating over a period of time. The gender profiles seem to differ between boys and between local authorities, and you'll see that a pretty high percentage of these, unsurprisingly, go through to child protection, 37%, and 15% result in an episode of care, often coming from the police, these referrals. Nonetheless, again, you can see that the majority, even of these episodes, are not going through to child protection, which again may be surprising. So obviously there's a lot of information there, and we're going to concentrate on just a few of the implications of all this work. Some limitations first. Obviously this is a sample of 6 local authorities, geographically concentrated in the southeast of England, so hard to generalise, across the country, let alone to other countries. And one of the things we obviously want to do is extend this analysis to a national data set. We also think that to probe more deeply into the reasons why some children end up on different intervention pathways from others, we really need household socioeconomic data. In terms of deprivation, what you can say is that anything with neglect in it has got a very steep social gradient, but more than that, you can't really say. Now, the 2 complex needs typologies, obviously, if you're a social worker thinking about risk, these are the ones that immediately strike you. They're the ones most likely to end up as child protection or result in an episode of care. But they don't really match up to this exclusive focus on the toxic trio that we've kind of got used to in the world of child protection. For one thing, complex needs may include, but they're not strictly speaking defined by the toxic trio factors, and that's certainly the case for the highest risk category. Moreover, the majority of episodes don't meet the threshold for child protection, even in the highest risk category. So it's not as if social workers, even when they're seeing some of those factors come up in combination, automatically thinking, well, this is definitely a risk of significant harm and we need to have a child protection conference here. Those operational definitions do not match up to what we think the discourse is telling us, if you like. The same applies, of course, to domestic violence itself. Strictly speaking, if there is domestic violence in the household, strictly speaking, then you'd say that is the child is at risk at the very least of emotional abuse, and probably also physical abuse. Again, operational decisions are being made so that the majority of these referrals are not resulting either in an intervention at all, or are being dealt with under the remit of children in need. Now, there has been a lot of unease already in the sector and in the field about the terminology of toxicity, if you like. And as I mentioned, the phrase originally I suppose became well known because of the serious case reviews, but the authors of that have recognised that it's not actually, that it may be counterproductive to use it. And in the last serious case review report, they prefer the term cumulative risk of harm, and I'd argue that the evidence here supports that. Certainly, if you, and this is not analysis we've shown here, but when we looked at what happens when these categories get turned into child protection plans, what happens is that they often turn into neglect. So neglect often makes the difference. So you may have a combination of two or maybe three various factors at assessment. When neglect is there as well, then that's when it then becomes a child protection plan. So we think that although what we know about neglect is that that's where the social gradient intervention is at its highest, that's where the social context of harm is probably needs most to be considered. And yet it's not there. It's not there as a factor assessment. It's lying underneath the surface. So some of what these categories are telling us is that the social context of demand is actually feeding through into operational decisions about maltreatment without it being explicitly recognised in the factors that are being recorded. And that is not to criticise social workers who are making these assessments, because they're doing so in context where it is the main concern is to make an assessment about risk to the child. But what it does point to is a need to move beyond the toxic trio language, and we believe that this is where these typologies can help us. Interesting, when we talk to social workers and managers in these local authorities about demand for child welfare services generally, they talk to us about poverty, and they talk to us about deprivation and austerity, and about the difficulties that families were experiencing in their communities in terms of isolation and support networks and so on. When we talk to them about case vignettes and case scenarios, they talk to us about domestic violence and parental substance misuse, and what would cause them to escalate the intervention to child protection. So it's about I suppose the scope of analysis that this allows. So whereas we as practitioners very understandably focusing on the risk factors in individual families, if we're thinking about child welfare as an overall problem in terms of demand, then we need to look down through the thresholds at what those categories can tell us about the need and the reasons for those needs in the local area, in the local community, and beyond. So that's to finish with, that's what these downward arrows through the thresholds are talking about. If you can imagine, one example of this is something like child sexual exploitation or county lines, drug running, and the involvement of young people in child criminal exploitation. This nowadays tends to get treated as a strategic problem. So you have the police, children's social care, various other agencies working together on how best to deal with this as a cluster of problems. They're recognising that putting young people on child protection plans probably isn't the right way to go about stamping out county lines drug running. I would argue that the administrative data and the insights it can give us about underlying patterns of demand in our areas can mean that we can do something similar for what you call more the bread and butter issues of child protection and children's social care. So you can have information about who are these children that are being referred in relation just to physical abuse by schools. What can we find out about what that problem means and represents in the community? Because what you'll find is that social workers, other professionals, agencies, community leaders and people in general in the community will have a lot of knowledge about that particular problem in context. So we think the scope in terms of planning and design to use the data for more than it's currently being used for, and to complement the individual targeted approach where you intervene in situations where children are at risk, to investing in quite a focused and targeted way on the underlying social problems that give rise to child welfare concerns. So it's with that I'll finish, and thank you for listening.